The thunderous crack of a gunshot split the air as Josephine Keller slammed the front door of her small apothecary shop, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. Sweetwater, Wyoming Territory, 1878, was no place for a woman alone, but Josephine had never been one to back down from a challenge, not even when that challenge came in the form of Horace Willington and his band of wealthy land grabbers. "Miss Keller." Willington's voice boomed from the street outside. "I strongly suggest you reconsider my offer before things get unpleasant." Josephine pressed her back against the door, her honey-blonde hair escaping its pins as she caught her breath. The small glass bottles on her shelves rattled as another shot rang out, this one striking her wooden sign. Through the window, she could see Willington standing in the dusty street, flanked by his men, his expensive suit and gold pocket watch glinting in the harsh sunlight. "You have until tomorrow, Miss Keller," he called out. "Every business in Sweetwater has agreed to sell. You're the only one holding out." His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached. "This town is going to be the new railway hub, and I won't have some stubborn woman's herb shop ruining my plans." Josephine's fingers curled around the small derringer hidden in the pocket of her skirt. Her father hadn't raised her to bend to bullies, and she didn't intend to start now. The apothecary shop was her livelihood, her home, and all she had left of her parents. Selling to Willington wasn't an option. As Willington's footsteps receded, Josephine allowed herself to breathe. The railway was coming, that much was true. But she'd built this business from nothing after her parents died of influenza 3 years ago. The townsfolk depended on her remedies and medicines. Where would they go if she sold out? A knock at her back door startled her from her thoughts. She moved cautiously through the shop, past shelves of dried herbs and tinctures, the derringer still clutched in her palm. "Who is it?" she called, pressing herself against the wall beside the door. "Blake Edwards, madam. I've got a delivery from the Tucker farm." Blake Edwards. The name was familiar. He ran cattle on the north side of the valley, kept to himself mostly. Josephine had seen him in town occasionally, buying supplies or having a quiet drink at the saloon. He wasn't one of Willington's men as far as she knew. Cautiously, she opened the door a crack, only to find herself staring into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face beneath a battered cowboy hat. "Miss Keller," he said, tipping his hat. "Meg Tucker asked me to bring these herbs she's been drying for you." He held out a burlap sack, and then his eyes caught sight of the derringer. Expecting trouble, Josephine quickly pocketed the gun, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Mr. Edwards." "Yes, thank you." She opened the door wider, accepting the sack. "And yes, I suppose I am expecting trouble." Blake's gaze shifted past her to the front of the shop, where Willington's men were still visible through the window. "Willington's bunch giving you grief. They're trying to buy me out. For the railway." She straightened her shoulders. "But I'm not selling." A small smile tugged at the corner of Blake's mouth. "No, I don't reckon you would." Josephine raised an eyebrow. "You know me so well, Mr. Edwards," he chuckled, a warm sound that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "I know you saved my best horse last winter when no one else could. And I know you're the only one who stood up to Willington at the town meeting." He glanced at the men outside again. "Those fellas don't look like they're planning to take no for an answer." "They'll have to," Josephine said firmly, though a flicker of fear curled in her stomach. Blake nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Keller, I'm heading back to my ranch now, but I'll be in town again tomorrow if you need any help." He left the offer hanging. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards, but I can take care of myself." He smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. I never doubted it for a moment. As Blake walked away, Josephine closed the door, wondering why her heart was suddenly beating so fast. She had more important things to worry about than a handsome cowboy with kind eyes, like staying alive until morning. The night passed tensely, with Josephine sleeping fitfully in the small room above her shop, the derringer beneath her pillow. She woke at dawn, as was her habit, and began preparing for the day, grinding herbs and mixing tinctures. If Willington thought she would be scared off, he had another thing coming. Around mid-morning, the bell above her door jingled. Josephine looked up, her hand automatically reaching for the derringer, but it was only Mrs. Finley, the baker's wife. "Josephine, dear, Mrs. Finley whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I've come to warn you. Willington's hired some men from out of town, mean-looking sorts. They're saying they'll burn you out if you don't sell." Josephine's stomach knotted. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Finley. Why don't you just sell, dear? It's not safe for you here anymore. No one would blame you." Josephine shook her head. "This shop was my father's dream, and what about you? Where will you get your rheumatism medicine if I go?" Mrs. Finley patted her hand. "You're a good girl, Josephine. But sometimes we have to bend with the wind." "I'm not bending for Horace Willington," Josephine said firmly. After Mrs. Finley left, Josephine found herself pacing the shop. She wasn't naive. She knew what men like Willington were capable of. But the thought of abandoning her parents' legacy, of leaving the people who depended on her remedies, was unbearable. The bell jingled again, and this time it was Blake Edwards who entered, looking even more imposing indoors than he had the day before. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his temples. "Miss Keller," he said, his voice low. "I heard some talk in town, thought I should check on you." "Let me guess," Josephine said dryly. "Willington's hired thugs to force me out." Blake's expression darkened. "You've heard, then. Word travels fast." She sighed, moving to the counter where she'd been working. "I'm not selling, Mr. Edwards. I didn't come to convince you otherwise." He stepped closer, his presence filling the small shop. "I came to offer you sanctuary. My ranch is far enough from town to be safe, but close enough that your customers could still reach you." Josephine stared at him, surprised. "You do that for a woman you barely know?" "I know enough," Blake said simply. "I know you're the only one in this town with the backbone to stand up to Willington, and that's the kind of woman." He trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed. "The kind of woman what, Mr. Edwards?" "The kind of woman this town needs," he finished, though something in his eyes suggested he'd been about to say something else. Josephine considered his offer. Leaving felt like giving in, but staying might be suicide, and it wasn't just herself she had to think about. If Willington's men set fire to her shop, the neighboring buildings could burn too. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but I can't leave. Not yet. I have to try to reason with Willington first." Blake's jaw tightened. Reasoning with men like that is like reasoning with a rattlesnake. "Nevertheless, I have to try." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but I'm staying in town tonight. The Johnsons have a spare room they let me use sometimes." "That's not necessary." "It is," he interrupted, "and it's not up for debate, Miss Keller." Before Josephine could argue further, the door flew open and Horace Willington himself strode in, flanked by two rough-looking men she didn't recognize. "Miss Keller," Willington said, his voice oily. "I trust you've reconsidered my generous offer." Josephine straightened her spine. "I have not, Mr. Willington, and I won't. This shop is not for sale." Willington's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I was afraid you might say that." He gestured to the men beside him. "These gentlemen are here to help you understand the gravity of your situation." Blake moved to stand between Josephine and the intruders. "I think the lady's been clear, Willington." Willington's eyes narrowed. "Edwards, this doesn't concern you." "It does now," Blake said, his hand resting casually near his holster. One of Willington's thugs reached for his gun, but Blake was faster, his revolver appearing in his hand as if by magic. "I wouldn't," Blake said softly, and the danger in his voice made Josephine shiver. Willington's face contorted with anger. "You're making a mistake, Edwards. I own half this town already. When the railway comes through, I'll own all of it." "Not this shop," Josephine said firmly, moving to stand beside Blake. "Now please leave. I have customers to attend to." For a tense moment, Willington looked like he might explode, but then he smoothed his expensive jacket and forced a smile. "This isn't over, Miss Keller. Not by a long shot." He turned on his heel and left, his men following reluctantly. After they'd gone, Josephine released a shaky breath. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards." Blake holstered his gun. "He'll be back, and next time he might not come himself. Men like that prefer to keep their hands clean." "I know." Josephine moved to the counter, trying to steady her trembling hands. "But I meant what I said. I'm not selling." Blake watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "My offer stands. The ranch is yours if you need it." Josephine looked up at him, struck by the sincerity in his eyes. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Edwards?" "Really?" He hesitated, then said, "My father was a lot like Willington. Rich, powerful, used to getting his way. When I chose ranching over banking, he disowned me. Men like that, they think they can buy and sell people's dreams." He met her gaze. "Someone needs to prove them wrong." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared values that ran deeper than mere acquaintance. Josephine found herself studying Blake's face, noticing the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as hardship. "Call me Blake," he said softly. "If we're going to be allies against Willington, we might as well be on a first-name basis." "Josephine," she replied, offering her hand. "Or Josie to my friends." His hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused. "Are we friends then, Josie?" She smiled despite herself. "I suppose we are." The rest of the day passed without incident, but Josephine couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. Blake left to attend to some business but promised to return by nightfall. True to his word, as dusk fell, he appeared at her back door. "Any trouble?" he asked, stepping inside. "None," Josephine said, locking the door behind him. "But I don't expect that to last." Blake nodded grimly. "I spoke to a few people in town. Willington's been telling folks the railway won't stop in Sweetwater unless he controls all the property along Main Street. It's got people scared." "But that's not true, is it?" "Hard to say." Blake removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Railways go where the money is, and Willington has plenty of that." Josephine sighed, pouring them both cups of coffee. "So I'm fighting not just Willington, but the whole town's future." "Some might see it that way." Blake accepted the coffee gratefully. "But others admire what you're doing, standing up for what's right, regardless of the cost." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Josephine found herself studying Blake's profile in the lamplight, wondering about the life he'd led before coming to Sweetwater. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked. 5 years. Bought it with money I'd saved working cattle drives." A small smile touched his lips. "My father thought I'd come crawling back once I saw how hard ranching is. He didn't understand that I prefer hard work that means something over easy money that costs your soul." Josephine nodded, understanding perfectly. "My parents were the same way. They could have made more money selling patent medicines, but they believed in healing people honestly, even if it meant living modestly." "They raised a daughter with the same principles," Blake observed, his eyes warm as they met hers. Josephine felt herself blushing and quickly changed the subject. "What's your plan for tonight? I'll stay here if that's all right with you. Keep watch." "In the shop." "Unless you have a better suggestion." She hesitated, then said, There's a cot in the back room. It's not much, but it's better than sleeping in a chair. Blake nodded. That'll do fine. They prepared for the night, Josephine showing Blake where she kept extra blankets and making sure he had enough water. As she turned to go upstairs to her own room, Blake caught her hand. "Josie," he said softly, "no matter what happens, I want you to know I think what you're doing is brave. Not many would stand their ground against someone like Willington." His words warmed her more than they should have. "Thank you, Blake, for understanding, and for being here." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before releasing her hand. "Sleep well." Josephine climbed the stairs to her room, her mind whirling with thoughts of Willington's threats, the townspeople's fears, and the unexpected ally she'd found in Blake Edwards. It had been a long time since she'd let anyone help her. Since her parents' deaths, she'd been fiercely independent, determined to prove she could manage on her own. But there was something about Blake that made her want to trust him. Perhaps it was the way he spoke of his past, or the respect in his eyes when he looked at her. Or perhaps it was simply that, for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel alone. Sleep came fitfully, with Josephine waking at every creak and rustle. Just after midnight, she was startled fully awake by the sound of breaking glass from downstairs. Heart pounding, she grabbed her derringer and crept to the top of the stairs. "Blake," she called softly. No answer. Fear gripped her as she descended the stairs, the gun cold in her hand. The shop was dark, but moonlight spilled through the broken front window, illuminating a brick on the floor surrounded by shattered glass. There was no sign of Blake. A sound from the back room made her turn, raising the derringer. "It's me," Blake's voice came from the darkness, and then he appeared in the doorway, gun in hand. "Stay back from the window." Josephine nodded, moving to the counter for protection. "Did you see who threw it?" "No," Blake said grimly, "but there was a note attached." He handed her a piece of paper. In the dim light, she could just make out the words, "Last warning. Sell or burn." "Charming," Josephine muttered, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Blake moved to the broken window, peering cautiously into the street. "I don't think they're still out there, but they could come back." "What do we do?" He turned to face her, his expression resolute. "We get you out of here. Now, pack what you need. We're going to my ranch." "But Josie," Blake interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "They're not just threatening your business anymore. They're threatening your life." Josephine wanted to argue, but the brick on the floor was evidence enough that Willington's threats weren't empty. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Give me 10 minutes." She hurried back upstairs, packing a carpetbag with essentials, clothes, her father's medical books, a few personal items she couldn't bear to leave behind. When she returned downstairs, Blake had boarded up the broken window as best he could and was gathering her most valuable medicines. "I thought you might want to bring these," he said, indicating the rare herbs and tinctures he'd carefully packed in a crate. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. "Thank you." They slipped out the back door into the alley, where Blake had tied his horse. The night was cool and still, with only the distant sounds of the saloon to break the silence. Blake helped Josephine onto the horse, then mounted behind her, one arm securing her against his chest as he took the reins with his free hand. "Hold on," he murmured, and then they were moving, trotting quietly through the back streets until they reached the edge of town. Once clear of the buildings, Blake urged the horse into a gallop. Josephine clung to the saddle, acutely aware of Blake's solid presence behind her, the warmth of his chest against her back, the strength in the arm that held her steady. They rode for over an hour before reaching Blake's ranch, a modest but well-maintained property nestled in a small valley. The main house was simple but sturdy, with a wide porch and a stone chimney. Outbuildings and corrals spread out around it, and a small creek ran nearby. Blake helped Josephine dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "It's not much," he said, sounding almost apologetic as he led her toward the house. "It's beautiful," Josephine replied honestly. In the moonlight, with the mountains rising behind it and the creek sparkling nearby, the ranch had a peaceful quality that made her exhausted spirit lift. Inside, Blake lit a lamp, revealing a space that was plain but comfortable. A large fireplace dominated one wall, with a worn sofa and armchairs arranged before it. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that surprised Josephine with their variety. "You read Emerson?" she asked, spotting a familiar spine. Blake smiled almost shyly. "Is that so surprising?" "No," she said, realizing she meant it. "Not really." He showed her to a small bedroom off the main room. "This was meant to be a guest room, but I haven't had many visitors." He set her carpetbag on the bed. "Make yourself at home. I'll get a fire going." Left alone, Josephine sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. She was safe for now, but she'd essentially been driven from her home. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. When she emerged from the bedroom, Blake had a fire crackling in the hearth and was setting a kettle on the stove. "Thought you might want some tea," he said. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." "Thank you." She moved to the fireplace, extending her hands toward the warmth. "Blake, what am I going to do? I can't stay away from my shop forever, but I can't fight Willington and his men alone." Blake joined her by the fire, his face serious in the flickering light. "You're not alone, Josie." The simple statement, spoken with such conviction, nearly undid her. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of her parents' legacy, the responsibility of the shop, the struggle against Willington, all by herself. To hear someone like Blake say she wasn't alone was almost too much to bear. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you helping me?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "When I first came to Sweetwater," he finally said, "I was at a low point, running from my father's shadow, trying to prove I could make it on my own." He glanced at her. "I got sick that first winter, real sick. Fever, couldn't keep food down. My nearest neighbor found me and brought me to your father." Josephine's eyes widened. "I remember you," she said softly. "You were so ill, father was worried you wouldn't make it." Blake nodded. "Your father treated me for weeks. Wouldn't take a penny more than he needed for the medicines. Said it was his duty to heal, not to profit from suffering." He turned to face her fully. "When I heard what Willington was doing, trying to force you out, I couldn't stand by and watch, not when your family once saved my life." The kettle whistled, breaking the moment. Blake went to prepare the tea, returning with 2 steaming cups. "There's more to it than that, though," he said as he handed her a cup. "I've watched you since I recovered, seen how you care for everyone in town, rich or poor. How you keep your father's principles alive." His eyes met hers, earnest and unwavering. "When I heard you refused to sell to Willington, despite the pressure, despite the threats, I said to myself, that's the kind of woman I'd marry." The words hung in the air between them, Blake looking suddenly alarmed, as if he hadn't meant to say them aloud. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "That was presumptuous. I didn't mean—" "Did you mean it?" Josephine interrupted, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Blake hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, but I know we've only just become friends. I shouldn't have known," she said softly. "It's all right." She set down her tea, gathering her courage. "I've noticed you too, Blake, for longer than I'd care to admit." The hope that dawned in his eyes made something warm unfurl in Josephine's chest. "Josie," he said, his voice rough, "I'm not a rich man. I can't offer you the kind of life Willington could, but everything I have is honestly earned, and I'd share it all with you." "I don't want Willington's kind of wealth," Josephine said firmly. "I want a life with meaning, with purpose." She took a deep breath. "With someone who understands that some things matter more than money." Blake set down his own cup and took a step toward her. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering near her cheek. Josephine nodded and his palm cupped her face, warm and gentle. "I've wanted to do this since the moment I saw you standing in your shop, refusing to back down," he murmured, and then his lips met hers. The kiss was tender at first, a question more than a demand. But when Josephine responded, wrapping her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more urgent, a promise of things to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens with Willington, with the shop, with the railway, we'll face it together." "Together," Josephine agreed, marveling at how right it felt to say the word. The next morning they rode into town together, determined to confront Willington once and for all. But as they approached the main street, they were met with an unexpected sight. A crowd had gathered outside Josephine's shop, and at its center stood Sheriff Patterson. "What's happening?" Josephine asked as they dismounted. Blake's expression was grim. "Let's find out." They pushed through the crowd to find Willington and his men in handcuffs, being led toward the jail. Sheriff Patterson spotted them and made his way over. "Miss Keller, Mr. Edwards," he greeted them. "Glad you're both all right. We've been looking for you since last night." "What's going on, Sheriff?" Blake asked. "Seems Mr. Willington got impatient," the sheriff explained. "His men tried to burn down your shop last night, Miss Keller, but they were spotted by Mr. Johnson from the hardware store, who raised the alarm." The whole town turned out to douse the flames. Josephine gasped. "Is the shop—" "Some smoke damage and the front windows broken, of course, but it's still standing." Sheriff Patterson's eyes narrowed. "While we were putting out the fire, one of Willington's men got scared and started talking. Turns out Willington's been lying about the railway. The stop in Sweetwater was already approved, regardless of who owns the properties. He was trying to buy everything up cheap before the news became public," Blake realized. "Exactly." The sheriff nodded. "He'll be facing charges for attempted arson, among other things, and I doubt he'll be doing business in Sweetwater again." Relief flooded through Josephine. "Thank you, Sheriff, and please thank everyone who helped save my shop." As the sheriff moved away, Josephine turned to Blake, tears of gratitude and happiness welling in her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. Blake smiled, taking her hand in his. "No," he said softly, "it's just beginning." In the weeks that followed, Josephine repaired her shop with the help of the townspeople, many of whom admitted they'd admired her stand against Willington, but had been too afraid to speak up. Blake was a constant presence, dividing his time between his ranch and the shop, where he built new shelves and repaired the damaged roof. Their courtship was the talk of the town, but neither Josephine nor Blake paid much attention to the gossip. They were too busy falling deeper in love, discovering the shared values and complementary strengths that made them perfect partners. 3 months after the night, they fled to his ranch. Blake proposed properly, on one knee in the middle of Josephine's shop, with a simple silver ring that had belonged to his mother. Josephine accepted through happy tears, knowing she'd found a man who valued her strength rather than seeing it as a threat. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony by the creek on Blake's ranch. Josephine wore wildflowers in her hair and carried a bouquet of healing herbs, a symbol of the work she continued to do, now splitting her time between the shop in town and a new herb garden at the ranch. The railway came to Sweetwater that summer, bringing new prosperity to the town. But Josephine and Blake found their wealth in simpler things, in the life they built together, in the respect they shared, and in the knowledge that they had stood up for what was right, regardless of the cost. As they sat on their porch one evening watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Blake pulled Josephine close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, Standing up to Willington, it nearly cost you everything. Josephine smiled, leaning into his embrace. No, she said. It didn't nearly cost me everything. It brought me everything. She turned to face him, love shining in her eyes. It brought me you. Blake's kiss was gentle, a reaffirmation of the vows they'd made. I thank God every day for your stubborn heart, he murmured against her lips. And I thank God for the cowboy who saw my refusal to bow as strength, not defiance, she replied. As the last light faded from the sky, they remained on the porch, talking of the future they would build together. A future founded not on wealth or power, but on respect, partnership, and a love that had begun the moment a strong-willed apothecary refused to bow to the rich, and a principled cowboy recognized the woman he would marry.